this is more about how can you make your designs, your drawings more informative instead of less informative or confusing. What I want to start with is 4 useful line weights that I really like to use throughout my sketching and drawing. As you can see, I've lined them up here, and what we're basically seeing is I'm using 4 different types of line weight and line style almost to inform you about a certain thing about the design. Now, when we look at the first line, this is basically just a sketch, right? And what I mean by that is this is the line that I will be using to start my initial design, to just basically draw everything about the design before adding line weight on top. Because most of the time, and I think this is where it sometimes gets confusing for a lot of beginners and a lot of you, my students, is that you think that line weight should start from the start of your sketch. And while you can definitely do this, I would advise against it and first start with a basic line, a sketch line that establishes the entire design, and then you can go and add line weight into it. Now, of course, there are exceptions, like the last line that we see here, because it's broken up. It's hard to erase that line, especially if you're working with something like ink and fine liner. However, so the first line is, my sketch line. It's what I use to just start my initial design. Then the second line that you see, this is the thicker line. This is that line that you often see that what you think about when it comes to line weight. And now this line, as you can see, it kind of tapers from thin to thicker in the middle to thin again. This doesn't always necessarily have to be this way, but I like to do it this way because especially on organic forms, and we'll see that in the examples later, is you don't always want that line to be thick, equally thick across the entire form, because that will make the form more confusing or even just read worse than it did initially. Now, what this thicker line does is it should inform the reader, the audience, about the silhouette. Like, what does the silhouette of my design look like? What basically contains my design? And also the shadow. And this is something I find very useful, and this is something you'll see in product design as well, is that a thicker line will usually be used on more of the shadow side of the design to, again, establish the silhouette, but also just establish where the light might be hitting the object and where the object might fall into shadow, and where also the object might hit the ground or another plane. So when it comes in contact with something else, this is where you might want to use a thicker line. Then the third line is one that I use for form. What we can do is we can use those shadow lines, those shading lines, again, to indicate where my light source is coming from and to better describe the volume of my form. And we can also use those form lines to indicate where the form changes and to give us a better read on its overall structure. Then what we can do, which I also like to do, is instead of leaving all of this blank and just having shadow versus light, we can, by what I said, is if we use some shading lines that are wider apart, we can suggest some gradation in the surface itself so that it doesn't look like it's just pure white and the same value. So this is something I like to do as well in my line drawings. It's also very useful here because basically when you look at a cube with rounded corners, those rounded corners are basically cylinders. And when we shade a cylinder, we will have a highlight on that cylinder and the rest will fall in halftone and shadow. And so I want to suggest some of that by using some lighter shading lines on the light side, which is basically the halftones. And then use my form lines to suggest how this thing turns in space. And then just again use some parallel shading lines. You can draw them all across. I could have also just shaded like this, short ones, because that's usually easier on your hand and you can keep it straighter. That's a little bit up to you, but that's how you can then label again your shadow. If you look at this truck, you can see that I'm using thicker lines on my outer side. And you see here, this is a great example. This one falls into shadow, right? And this one goes into the light. So I just keep my sketch line there. I'm not using an equally thick side throughout. Like I said, you can definitely do it. I don't like to do it, but I definitely suggest my shadow side and my light side. And then my internal shapes will get usually, like you see here, thinner lines. And then I'm really emphasizing the ambient occlusion here. I'm almost putting everything that falls into shadow into that ambient occlusion shape. The reason I do that is I just love the graphic read of it. It's something that really works. It's something that if you were to pick